I'm so honored to introduce Commissioner Nathan Simington. He was nominated to serve as the Commissioner of the FCC by President Trump several years ago, and he joined us last year here at the Policy Summit. We're so happy to have him back. He previously was Senior Advisor at NTIA, and in this role, he worked on many aspects of telecommunications policy, including spectrum allocation and planning, broadband access, and the U.S. government's role in the internet. He also has a long private sector experience, which I think can just be so crucial to understanding the needs of the private sector and consumers. Prior to joining the commission, he was senior counsel to Brightstar Corp, an international mobile device services company. And in this capacity, he led and negotiated telecom equipment and service transactions with leading providers in over 20 countries. Prior to joining Brightstar, he worked as an attorney in private practice. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, and he holds a degree from the University of Rochester and Lawrence University. He grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada. Did I say that correctly? All right, woohoo. And he became a U.S. citizen and now lives here locally in McLean, Virginia with his family. So thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner. We look forward to your remarks.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to speak today. I plan to focus my remarks on the satellite service sector, both what I see for its future and what the FCC can do to ensure its success. Satellite service providers are industry leaders in cutting-edge technology development, as we've seen in the ISAM marketplace, and in broadband deployment to unserved and underserved areas. There are countless direct-to-cell deployments launching, perhaps literally, as I speak, and NGSO providers are filling in high-speed broadband service coverage gaps all over the United States and abroad. Satellites provide an abundance of essential services, including communications, tracking, navigation, weather forecasting, and imaging, just to name a few. Governments, industry, emergency service responders, and consumers use satellite networks for everything from high-frequency trading, storm tracking, and missile guidance, to using Google Maps to navigate a traffic jam. In its latest State of the Satellite Industry report, SIA states that in 2022, the global space economy was worth $384 billion, with satellite services making up $113 billion. That's incredible. And with the burgeoning launch industry, which is making launch and provision of satellite services more affordable, we will surely only see this number grow. There's so much going on in the satellite sector, it can be a challenge to choose which FCC policy goals to touch on today. But I'll focus on three areas where I believe American leadership is a must. Supplemental coverage from space, or direct-to-cell in industry terms, streamlining of the license application process, specifically FCC shot clocks, and changes to our market access rules for orbital debris. I think there are discrete policy tweaks the FCC can take to bolster US competitiveness as it conducts these proceedings. Starting with direct-to-cell, or SCS in FCC terms, I'm pleased to see that the FCC is crafting a flexible framework that allows the United States to take the lead on policymaking for this new service, while also ensuring that we do not constrict innovation prescriptively and harm fledgling business models. A strong but flexible regulatory framework is the best way for bolstering both America's leadership and industry success, particularly because it's not certain yet which models are going to be the most successful in the short, medium, long terms. There are many technological approaches and many satellite and other spectrum bands under consideration. So I'm excited to see this technology evolve and grow. I believe it's vital to the long-term future of broadband deployment in hard-to-reach areas and for connectedness generally in the short term. Direct-to-cell will, and currently is, allowing people to communicate in remote areas, particularly with emergency authorities, where before there was no way to communicate at all. It starts with getting the vital help you need when you're desperate and in the middle of nowhere, and may one day lead to user-transparent, always-on multimodal connectivity everywhere. We all remember the promise of Iridium in the early 1980s, when there were, when everyone was looking at the heavy lift of building all the necessary cell tower and cell equipment infrastructure and saying, wouldn't it just be easier to provision from space? Well, it's very hard to predict exactly what the future would look like. But having this kind of always-on connectivity capability has been a dream for many of us in our cell phones for a long time. But right now, these services are quite literally saving lives, and I'm think we're headed in the right direction from a policy perspective. I'm very happy to see it. Turning to streamlining of application processing, I think that the most important thing the FCC can do is to ensure swift and efficient action on its part. This is the only way to maintain American leadership in the satellite communication services industry. It will also nurture the growth of the broader space sector, which includes new and innovative manufacturing processes, robotics, Earth surveillance and exploration, and other as yet unknown innovations. Shot clocks and streamlined rules provide necessary certainty to industry and are invaluable for ensuring that we do not needlessly throw the brakes on a budding industry by laying a regulatory track that encourages anti-competitive gamesmanship. All too often, policymakers with good intentions get in the way of innovation, and yet those same regulators never seem to realize, much less suffer, the detriments caused by these supposedly good intentions. While it's vitally important that the FCC and other policymakers get things right, as I've said several times before, in this area, we know that the perfect is the enemy of the good. I've heard a continuous drumbeat from US licensed companies that delays in application processing are forcing them to entertain licensing in other countries with more industry-friendly and expeditious licensing processes. The FCC's application streamlining proceeding and the new Space Bureau will hopefully lead to rethinking such plans. The Bureau is off to a great start with adopting shot clocks for placing applications on public notice and establishing practices for greater transparency and staff guidance. So now I look forward to swiftly moving to execute on rules for final action shot clocks and take any other steps necessary to change our rules in order to reflect the current realities of the satellite industry. Now, of course, in this, the FCC will require ongoing whole-of-government support for vital international coordination, but must continue to press actively for this within the federal government by continuing to drive its own internal processes. Finally, I'd like to touch on orbital debris. I've said throughout the ongoing FCC proceeding and in several speeches before industry that we should apply the same orbital debris rules to both US licensed providers and market access licensees, which are foreign licensed entities who provide service in the USA. The FCC must move in this direction as a high priority policy goal. Our current process allows non-US licensed space stations to satisfy orbital debris rules by showing that debris mitigation plans for the space stations for which the US market access is requested are subject to direct oversight by the country in which they are licensed. While in principle such an approach may be sound, in practice it often places US licensed providers, and thus ultimately America as a policy leader, at a disadvantage. American companies should not be penalized for complying with a rigorous and advanced domestic regime that takes contemporary realities into account. The US government should not tolerate behavior from market access licensees that it would not accept from domestic licensees. The current process indirectly approves debris mitigation regimes that are typically not as robust as America's, disadvantaging American licensed providers. This is why I have and will continue to advocate for extending the FCC's orbital debris rules to market access providers. This not only levels the playing field for US licensed providers, but also acts as a regulatory hook for creating default rules for all commercial operators. The market power of the American onshore satellite services market gives the FCC an internationally unique degree of leverage to implement cutting-edge scientific knowledge from American space expert agencies in the international marketplace, allowing us to set the de facto international standard. So we can create a unitary set of clear and flexible rules for safe commercial space operation for all countries, which only makes sense because in space, borders are meaningless. I therefore again urge the FCC to reconsider the current approach so that we can firm up the US's global leadership on orbital debris mitigation policy and encourage a globally responsible approach to mitigation of space debris and the debris remediation industry. I think the policy goals I've touched on today should be top priorities for the FCC and government as a whole. If we do not get our ducks in a row here, we are at risk of falling behind other countries in the space sector, in broadband deployment in hard-to-reach areas, and in communications technology policy as a whole. We should buckle down and carefully deploy all of the tools in our tool belt to get there. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today. This is an exciting time. I'm glad to get the chance to talk with such an esteemed group, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the summit. And are we taking questions? Yes, I'm happy to take questions or discuss any of the points just mentioned, or for that matter, anything else anyone wants to bring up.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Simington, Tricia Paoletta, HWG. I did not read all the proceeding on the latest in terms of the subjecting market access licensees to U.S. orbital debris regime, our regime. What was the thinking as to not subjecting them to our rules on orbital debris?
That's a great question. Sure, not a problem. Okay, so that's a great question, and I wish I had a really solid answer for that. Just to recap for people who might not be as familiar with the history, it's been settled since about 2004 that the FCC is entitled to demand orbital debris filings and an orbital debris mitigation structure as part of the U.S. licensing process. And the thinking here is that we're responsible for defending the integrity of communication systems that we license, and part of that means taking orbital debris into account. The difficulty is that until recently, satellite constellations were much smaller than they are now. There are just many, many fewer satellites up there. If you look at the total world satellite population, when many of the key FCC decisions like Teledesic came down, then it was in the low hundreds, perhaps 300, 400 at the time. And now there are individual constellations that are above 5,000. And I'll have people come into my office and say, yeah, we're doing a small constellation, only 300. It's a different world, right? And so the FCC's interest in orbital debris used to be much easier to serve. You had many fewer satellites to think about. They were higher, they were farther apart. And what's more, in many cases, and in fact, to the present day, much of the debris risk comes from items that were never within FCC jurisdiction, defunct Soviet rocket bodies, things of that nature. So coping with the new orbital debris environment is in part adapting to the much denser LEO population, as well as to the lower per satellite characteristic risk profile of LEO, and thinking for the first time about giving credit for constellation behavior rather than treating each individual satellite as an uncorrelated collision risk. So all this is unexplored territory at the FCC, and it's very easy for actors in the rest of the federal government to say the FCC is not, in fact, a rocket scientist agency. It's not an expert space agency and shouldn't necessarily have an opinion on this kind of thing. This is why I'm calling for a whole of government approach, and I think that sort of begins to answer your question, because with the whole of government, we can, for the first time, take the FCC's jurisdiction and then leverage that expert knowledge that we have elsewhere in the federal government through the FCC's licensing power, which has the ability to reach international operators who are not in any way subject to NASA or the FAA or anyone else on shore. So as for why this wasn't addressed, I think it's a big change in the thinking of how we have traditionally done things at the agency, but it's a necessary and welcome one, and we should adopt it, and we should closely engage with the expert agencies within the rest of the federal government to make sure that this becomes the new norm.
Commissioner Simon, this is Chip Pickering, and I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you for coming. Coming last year and the year before, your focus on issues that sometimes get left behind at the FCC is greatly appreciated, and especially as it relates to satellite and space and the critical work that you're doing. So thank you for coming.